Hey everybody. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick look at Chapter 6, a quick introduction to differentiated instruction and the universal design for learning principles. So in this chapter we're going to be focusing on the pass variables, and the pass variables is what Master Puri wants to hit for the main idea um, for Chapter 6. And it's a system that we can kind of follow to give us a little basic insight on what does it really mean to differentiate instruction for students. And not necessarily students with disabilities or special needs, but for everybody in our class with high ability, low ability, specific splinter skill, both superior skill, and students that might need a little bit of extra help. That is completely not disability related either. So just to get right into it, our pass variable has 4 parts: prioritizing objectives, adapting instruction, systematically teaching, and then systematically evaluating. So what we're going to do is we're going to work our way through each of these 4 variables and give you guys a little bit of an introduction. So our first component, I guess you could say, in the pass variable is prioritizing instruction and prioritizing objectives. This is important because when we plan lessons, we can oftentimes get lazy looking at the teacher's edition, looking at our curriculum maps, and what do? We look at the next lesson in the book, the next chapter in the book, and we do what it tells us, or we do what the curriculum map says we need to cover. But we're also kind of missing the point a little bit of the idea of planning our own unique lessons to fit the needs of our class. We're talking about prioritizing objectives. We're not talking about cutting out things or even adding on extra things, although we certainly can. We're talking about putting things in order of importance, of scope, and of sequence. This is important especially for students with learning difficulties, be it intellectual disability, learning disability, attention problems, or otherwise, because for any of a number of various disabilities, we may be working with students with limited mental dexterity, limited attention span, high mental fatigue, or otherwise hardships in reading, decoding, fluency or comprehension, or otherwise. So we have to pick and we have to design things which are most important and most prioritized for students. So let's say, for example, we take a lesson and we have 4 main components. What we might have to ask ourselves is not only what are we going to teach first, second, third, or fourth, but also what is the most important thing that we're trying to teach. And sometimes we can even use a process of elimination while doing this. If we could only have students master 3 of our 4 objectives, which 3 would be most important? What if we could only pick 2 of those 3? What if we could only pick 1 of those 2? After we've done this, we've created somewhat of a hierarchy of potential objectives, and we can approach our lesson as such. Whereas we want to reach everybody in our direct instruction, and there is only one of us, and there is only one lesson to be taught. But we can approach the objectives in a systematic way to try and spend the most amount of our resources on what we want the most amount of students to be able to come away from with either learning, understanding, mastery, or whatever the point of the lesson is. And we'll get into some of those finer points here in a little bit. So we may spend more or most of our time on our primary objectives, and on our secondary objectives we have a couple of options. We could potentially break up into small groups and focus on secondary objectives on different levels for different ability groupings. We could potentially use mixed ability grouping so that we could give students very ability appropriate roles within the group dynamic. We could possibly create learning stations, or we could possibly create different levels of independent practice. So when we're talking about objectives, let's operationalize the definition of what an objective is. You can think of an objective like a goal, and we've already talked about goals a lot with the IEP process, and that we need to have both observable and measurable criteria. And they have the content, the conditions, and the criteria. And we've already done this, like I said, with IEP goals. But so we have our example here. A student will write 5 precipitating causes of the Civil War with 100% accuracy. We can even improve on this. We can say when given an oral prompt, or when given a free response writing prompt, or we can even further operationalize the condition that is to be met. And for the second part, it could be a student will perform said task. Remember that the said task should be something that is specific to the actual lesson that's being taught, and it should be something that's relatively heavily prioritized, and we want to be able to put a success indicator at the end of it. It could be 100%, it could be 4 out of 5 times, it could be 8 out of 10 times, and you could also put an extra modifier of 2 out of 3 trials or 2 out of 3 attempts, just for further consistency. And you might notice this in some of our curricular-based measures, whereas we measure something formatively, and we check for understanding, and we kind of get a general idea of how many people understand and at what level. Then we get another layer of information when we provide independent practice. We can get another layer of data when we do more short-term review, let's say like a chapter review, and then we can get more formalized summative data when we take like a chapter test or something like that. So you can see that we have several different attempts or sets or opportunities for students to show their proficiency in said task. So you could even potentially put modifiers for each of the levels. You could change them from independent practice to review to test, and you could potentially kind of take a slider type of an approach and gradually increase the level of proficiency on each of those set activities. Now make sure not to be before I move on, I just want to say make sure not to be overly generalized when you are making your objective. For example, a student will increase, or student will score 100% on the test, or a student will increase 1 grade level, or they will something that is relatively subjective. Remember that when we're creating the test, we should really be using backwards design, whereas we're creating a test at the beginning of the unit planning process, because if we want to have set objectives out, and not to get too far into the whole LAMP process, you'll know about LAMP when you do student teaching, but using this backwards design, we pick our objectives, and then we make our tests to understand first we decide at what level we would like to assess and teach said objectives. It might be 40%, 30%, 20%, 10%. Basically, let's say you give a test that's 100 points, and it's covering 4 standards. The percentage of which you're covering the standards on the test should ultimately align with the percentage of time that you're spending covering said things in class, because that nice proportional relationship will carry over. But anyways, so when we're planning instruction based on objectives, we have a couple terms here that's going to help you guys out. We might plan based on either scope or on sequence. Scope meaning the breadth, and you could think of it as depth, okay? Scope or depth, somewhat interchangeable. Are we going to, for example, an introduction to a topic, to a new topic, we will be covering maybe a lot or a relatively broad scope of information, but at a relatively shallow level. Whereas if we get into specifics on, okay, let's say for example we do a unit on the Civil War. Maybe we introduce the Civil War with a broad scope of it's kind of the broad strokes of what happens in the Civil War from beginning to end. What leads up to it, major events, and the ending. That's a decent introduction that gives students context on which they can build or scaffold. Then, as we go into a second phase of lesson planning, we can then go a little bit deeper, but yet also narrower in subsequent lessons. It could be, a whole lesson on the Battle of Bull Run, on Sherman's March, on, any of the major events in Civil War. You can spend a whole day or a week, and there's whole college level classes just dedicated to very small portions of the Civil War. Those are very deep, but also very narrow when we're talking about the scope of those particular lessons. We want to use that in combination because we don't want to go too deep too soon, because then they're not going to have that background context to be able to scaffold off of. And we don't want to be too shallow in depth, because then we'll have a nice basic level of learning. But for students, and especially for students who are a little bit higher ability, and for students who are interested in it, they're going to be left kind of unsatisfied and wanting more. Now, sequence is important too, and when we talk about order, we don't want to say that, okay, go back to the Civil War, 1861, 1862, 1863, and so on and so forth. That's not exactly what we're talking about sequence. By sequence, we need to order our lessons in a unit, and even our units sometimes, relatively strategically, to make sure that students understand or have the prerequisite information for a particular unit before we begin. Because the last thing that we want to do is to go into a lesson and then have to reteach a bunch of things, or potentially even pre-teach some things because we've planned our units or our lessons in said units out of order. This can be very hierarchical, depending on types of skills that you're trying to do. Like, for example, you wouldn't want to teach long division without having a good understanding of both basic times tables and also multi-digit multiplication, because they need to be able, first of all, to understand the relationships and the fact families between the factors, and then your basic facts for multiplication, and understand that the inverse facts are also the same for division. And we don't want to get into 2 by 2 or more complicated multiplication problems without basic facts, because then we're going to have computational errors. And we don't want to get into division before we have understanding of the 2 by 2 or more advanced multiplication, because we want students to have understanding of the carrying over, place value, etc., and some of the more intermediate types of concepts that you teach in more advanced multiplication. So you can see that, think of it as one layer builds on the other. And I suppose you could call it scaffolding, because you are using the previous learning and knowledge to build off of, and to build new knowledge on or off of. But I'd rather use this layered approach, whereas we need to have a solid foundation before we build the first floor, and the first floor needs to be sound before we build the second floor. So anyways, we were talking about planning and prioritizing our objectives. Understand that there's quite a bit that goes into it. So our next variable, this idea of adaptation. And this is going to be the hard part, because we need to adapt a lot of times on the fly, and we have to have a lot of individual and personal information about our students to be able to make well-informed decisions, because if we don't, and we make either assumptions or generalizations, what we're doing is we're really taking a spaghetti style approach, whereas we're trying to throw things at the wall to see what sticks, and we're kind of hoping that something does. While this brute force type of approach may work over time, this isn't very time efficient, both for you and for your students. And there is only so much time in a day that you have to offer as one person, and you only have so many instructional minutes in a day to spend with your students on a particular topic. So this brute force approach, given infinite amount of time and infinite amount of resources, absolutely it would work, because you can literally try everything. We don't have that sort of luxury and we're in a field where our resources are relatively scarce, both our time and the students' time alike. So when we're talking about adaptations, we need to adapt for different learner levels, different types of learning styles, and different types of learning needs. When we do our more advanced boot camp on lesson planning, differentiated lesson planning, we're going to use the reoccurring diamond pattern, okay, when we're talking about adaptation, because I want you to think of, or maybe like a helix, okay, you could think of it as a helix as well, like a double helix, a strand of DNA, whereas we have a coming together point, and then a stretching out point, and then a subsequent coming back together point. That's kind of the visual model that I use, and that I wanted to share with you guys about this idea of adapting or differentiating particular parts of your instruction. Remember that we only have one lesson to teach. We cannot plan and deliver 4 different lessons with only one of us. It's not possible, it's not feasible, and it's not an equitable process for the students, because we're giving them entirely different educations at that point. But what we can do is we can use this helix model, and we can have points where we come together, where the entire class is going to learn, preview, review, come together, and then we're going to have breakout points. And in these breakout points, you can consider it like a spectrum, okay? Like a ray of light goes into a prism and the whole rainbow of colors come out. We have red and yellow and orange and green and all the different colors. This is what we can do to adapt instruction. There's going to be times where we have to deliver direct instruction. That's just an inevitability. It's to preview something, it's to go through a new step, or what have you. But it's those branching out times that we can differentiate said instruction, and we can provide maybe a more advanced enrichment style activity, or station, or some sort of learning opportunity for students who will be more problem-based or creative enrichment style activities. We can provide more direct instruction, rote, lower level maintenance rehearsal level drill and practice for students who are still trying to master basic concepts. Or we could provide something in between, including several creative outlets that would be receptive to students with several learning styles. This is where the idea of stations, okay, learning stations, comes into play and can be used very effectively, because there is only one of you, and you can't be in more than one place at one time, but you can have several activities in different places, and you can monitor and kind of bounce back and forth between said. And yes, you will probably be spending more time with students that need more one-on-one help. This is this concept of dynamic balance that I talked about a lot in the discussion board, that this idea of, giving students what they need does not mean giving students the same thing. Okay, so the quality of opportunity does not equal a quality of outcome. We want to have a quality of outcome, whereas students are getting everything they need. Quality of opportunity means that we need to be able to give them what they need at the time. Okay, some students want to be very self-directed, and they want to figure things out. They're very problem-based learners, and that's great. We want to give them that opportunity to be able to figure things out. And yes, we'll be there to help and answer questions and guide them, but they don't want someone, henpecking at them and looking over their shoulder every 2 seconds, because they want to sit there and they want to figure it out. It's this idea of problem-based learning that some students really like, and more independent-based learning. Some students are going to need much more help and much more reinforcement, and that's going to require possibly some extra direct instruction time, either in small groups or individually, going over steps, repeating processes, or what have you. And those students will require some more time. So it is perfectly understandable to think that you do want to spend, it's well-intentioned, okay? So I'm not saying that it's not to want to give everybody the same amount of time, but that might not be something that's realistic, and that might not be something that all students may not want, that amount of time. And some students may want to be more independent than others, and some students may not have the need. As long as everybody's getting the proper outcome that's going to help them, the opportunity or the means by which we get there, there can be some variances in that. That's perfectly fine. So when we're adapting instruction, aside from our 3 learning styles, and we're actually going to watch a video later on to say that there is between hybrids and different subsets, as many as 72 different learning styles. You can understand that students have different strengths and learn, better or differently in a variety of different ways. Okay, and this goes beyond tactile, auditory, and visual. Some students are very physical learners and learn by doing, experiencing, touching, right? Some students learn with their senses. Some students want to express things, either written or verbal expression, written expression, or you may want to express things in more, visual types of, like artistic representations, dioramas, Lego or Erector or Connects, or any sort of other sorts of tactile representations of something, and that's great. And some people want to, some people could role play, act, put out skits, make little plays, or whatever. So there's many things that students are good at, going back to the idea of multiple intelligences that we talked about in chapter 5. And the more that we learn about our students, and the more that we're around them, the more that we really get to understand what are the individual strengths of our students. And then we can go and we can start to plan in the branching out part of our helix, those different colored, parts of the spectrum that are going to reach and touch on the strengths of each of those. And it might also help students get outside of their comfort zone and maybe experience new things that they might not have otherwise done. And we may be exposing students to a new type or a new style of activity that they may catch fire and run with it. And this is this idea of universal design in a nutshell. What can be good for some people, and what is ultimately designed for a very small amount of people, can ultimately be good for many more people than was originally intended. Just like Siri on the iPhone, the origination of Siri was to help blind users use a touchscreen interface, because if you can't see a touchscreen, how are you supposed to use it? Makes perfect sense. Well, the developers started making it until a couple of the techie people started realizing, hey, this is convenient. I can do this. I can have it talk to me. I can talk to it. It can dictate messages for me, so I don't have to sit there and type it out, or I might not, I won't fat finger it or something if I'm trying to send a text. And this is really neat. And nowadays we use there's voice activation everywhere. Alexa, do this. Siri, hey Siri. Hey Google. Xbox. Pretty much all of the major multimedia platforms have some sort of voice control. And that all started from a very, very slim and narrow purpose, which was to help people who are blind or who otherwise cannot operate touchscreen and provide verbal commands to be able to operate said types of computer technology or other types of graphic interfaces that would be very hard to interact with without being able to actually see and interact with it. So like I said, we have students with lots of different strengths that learn in many different ways and that have many different intellectual, under the idea of multiple intelligences, intellectual strengths and relative weaknesses. We want to help support strengths while not necessarily ignoring weaknesses, because we always want to work on our weak areas. Any fitness expert will tell you, you always want to work on, you're only good as your weakest area, and you can work out and have the strongest arms or biceps as you want, but that doesn't necessarily mean a full bill of health. If you don't do a little bit of cardio to back it up, you might have muscles, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're in good overall health. So, we've talked about planning. We're going to prioritize our objectives, and we're going to plan both the scope and the sequence of our lessons. Okay, so is it going to be shallow but broad? Is it going to be deep but narrow? Are we building a foundation? Are we building a first floor, a second floor? To what extent is the lesson going to fit in our hierarchy on our totem pole, with higher ordered things coming on the top? We talked about adapting, reaching students with different learning styles, learning needs, the idea of balance in our help, the idea of equality of outcome as opposed to equality of opportunity. So now how do we go about this? Systematically teaching. This is our direct instruction time, and this is the part where it comes together. Okay, in our helix, this is the part where we have the convergence, where the helix twists around and we see almost an intersection of the points. So the book uses this SCREAM model, and there's a few different models, so you can take them for what they're worth. They are somewhat of a dime a dozen, but we can go through this one because Master Pieri talks about it quite a bit. So structuring your lesson and communicating to students. First of all, understanding and making sure that students understand the purpose of the lesson, because we can't hope to get students engaged unless we sell students on why they should be paying attention, as opposed to any of the other things that could potentially be distracting them. Make some sort of real life connection to said lesson, or if that's not possible, and oftentimes it's not, pose some sort of problem, or potentially, and maybe not a problem, perhaps a question, perhaps something, a dilemma, a conflict, something that needs resolving. That's going to help students that once they have problem-based learners, critical thinkers, that's really going to pique their interest, because the critical thinkers and problem solvers want to figure these things out. And if what you're going to go through and help and teach and tell them is going to help them figure that out, that's going to be a little bit more engaging. Clarity. is this idea of direct language, especially in instruction. We want to make sure that we're using language that students can understand, that can't be misinterpreted. So when we're using vocabulary, we need to be very careful that we're using said language. Redundancy, use very sparingly, okay, because we don't want to be over redundant, because that begins to be repeating things that especially students have a hard time with. That can be good, because review is good, okay? Review is good. Over repetition is bad, because it just sounds like a broken record, and you start to lose people because it's like, oh, this again, blah blah blah. This sometimes becomes problematic, because when is the proper time to actually cut off, right? When do we cut this off? And the answer is it may be different for different people. And once again, this is where learning stations and leveled independent practice comes in. This is going to be one of the key things that we talk about in the boot camp, but we're going to preview it right now. The idea of leveled independent practice. You can have level 1, level 2, level 3. Okay, and students need to reach particular scores, levels of mastery, or performance standards to either have access or move on to next level of either difficulty, or you could go from the levels of learning, from maintenance rehearsal to elaborative to organizational learning. So you're going up the criticality chain, if you will. So students will have to be able to show that they know 95% of all the vocabulary words, or whatever their spelling words, vocabulary words, history terms or dates or whatever, and then they can go on to level 2, which would be more elaborative, which would be maybe like not necessarily an essay, because that's a little bit plain Jane, but it could be a essay, it could be a diorama, it could be some sort of graphic design thing that they make on the computer, but something to elaborate on beyond the facts, to show that they understand more than just the basic facts. And then the idea of organization, which is being able to put concepts into a hierarchy. For example, you may have things from a very broad category to a very narrow category. You could have your most advanced category. Well, you could talk about trade. Okay, that could be a very broad category. Trade, we could have trade, currency, and then economics. Okay, because trade, currency was an evolution of trade, and economics in the theories of economics is a evolution of utilization of currency in trade. And then you can have microeconomics, finance, and all of the and all the more specified or specialized parts of econ, right? So we have 4 levels of organizational thought in said hierarchy. So anyways, that's one idea, this idea of tiered independent practice, that students can master level 1, level 2, level 3. Once again, the use of learning stations, or like the tiered independent practice, that can help a lot to help students reinforce that. So those who need to be reinforced can help reinforce, and students that are a little bit ahead of the game, it's going to give them opportunities to remain engaged. Okay, and that's really the important part, 'cause like we said in chapter 5, we don't want to keep giving students 5 times of the same difficulty of worksheet. That's not any good. Enthusiasm, because you want to, if you're not interested and you don't look interested, your students won't be. Pacing or appropriate rate of presentation, not too fast or too slow. And then maximizing engagement. It's taking time to get students involved, and also engagement can be in the previewing process, to present the problem, to get students feedback on the problem, or check for understanding, think, pair, share, turn and talk, any of a million different things that you can do to get students working together. And you can also use it as formative assessment, because you're going to be able to see who's struggling, who's having a good time, who is this way too easy for? That's all important information. So we've hit a lot of these already, so we can go over them relatively quickly. The idea of engagement, maximizing on-task behavior, and maximizing learning time is making sure that we have proper plans in place, that we properly scaffolded so that we're not going back and we're not reteaching. We properly sequenced everything. We properly done our formative assessments, and we're stopping or checking for understanding so that we don't get to the end of the lesson and realize, uh-oh, I should have backed up 20 minutes ago. That can be that can be just as big of a problem as having to stop. Because, okay, if you have to go back 20 minutes because you got way too far ahead of your students, you've effectively lost that 20 minutes. And, it may as well have been students just talking and carrying on for that amount of time, because that's really all the result that you've gotten out of it. And then lastly, this idea of systematic evaluation. Okay, and this is going to include both formal and informal assessments, both formative and summative assessments. Remember that formative happens during the actual assessment or during the actual direct instruction, and summative assessment happens at the end of the direct instruction. And you can do anything. Remember that a formal evaluation does not necessarily have to be a standardized test. It could just be a regular test or a quiz. And remember that informal assessment doesn't just have to be questioning, okay? It's a spectrum from informal to formal, and there are some things relatively in the middle. You can have things like pre-tests, okay, that are relatively informal, especially if you don't take them for grades, but they are given in a relatively formal manner, right? A test is a relatively formal form of evaluation, but in the case for our points for grades or things like that, it's an informal assessment because we're not taking it for points, it's not affecting a grade, it's just a performance indicator that we're using so that we can help plan, tweak, and make real-time decisions regarding our class, where they're at, and what we need to do to help them get to where we want them to be in our objectives. Also, it's going to help us be able to better distribute the amount of time and resources that we're spending on said objectives. Instead of 40, 30, 20, 10, maybe we need to realize, yeah, we really need to focus more on 1 and 2, so maybe we might go 40, 40, 10, 10, or 40, 40, 15, and then if we get to the end, then so be it. But there's going to be no hope of getting to objective 4 unless they've mastered 3 and 2 and 1. So once again, equal is not necessarily equality, and in this particular instance, and sometimes we have to make tough decisions on how we are going to spend our limited resources. So the idea of curricular-based measures, this can be anything from independent practice type activities to quizzes. So if you just even break the word down, curricular, so it's coming from your lesson, from the curriculum, based measure, something that we're going to monitor progress with. We can also use for, let's say, early reading and early math and number sense. We can use some norm reference testing instead of curricular-based measures to say, okay, at grade level 2.1, grade level 2, month number 1, a student should be at X performance. We can then take some data from and give those grade appropriate number sets to our students, and we can say, okay, on average we're scoring at 80%, but the standard, between the standard deviations and things like that, we're noticing we have a big hump of students scoring between 85 and 95%, and then the hump kind of goes down, and then there's another hump of students that are scoring between 55 and 70%. And so then we can try to dig a little bit deeper and say, is there some sort of connection between the students that because there is that hump, and there's a noticeable hump of students that are scoring a little bit lower. Could it be that maybe there's two previous grade teachers, and the one teacher spent a bunch of time on something, but the other teacher only spent a little bit of time on something? Or, could it be just an ability type of a discrepancy? Absolutely, it possibly could. And that's good for our Tier 2 RTI, because if we've identified a group of students that need help on a specific thing, it's a perfect opportunity to use ability type grouping to be able to provide more targeted and specific instructions. Or on specific topics, we know that we can create that we need, and there's a objective need based on the data for lower level maintenance rehearsal, learning stations, independent practice. But since there's a lot of students scoring above average, there may be, there's also a demonstrated need, according to the statistics, for some more advanced type of independent practice, maybe more problem-based, creative, critical thinking-based things that are more open-ended, more project-oriented, where students can really use the elaborative skills, their elaborative cognition, their organizational cognition in their brain to be able to make those higher order connections. So we're really using this data, and this is why I think pre-testing and formative assessment is so important, because we're using this data. What we don't want to do is we don't want to get into the situation where at the end of the lesson and we give the test and we're looking through bad test scores and we're shaking our heads. That is, we failed at that point. Okay, there's no way around it. No, we're not failing because the kids failed. We're failing because we didn't predict this. If we're shaking our heads at students and shrugging our shoulders and wondering why, we did something wrong. We should be able to accurately predict, within a certain margin of error. We're not psychics, but we should be able to predict relatively accurately how a student should perform on a test based on the formative data that we've collected. That's in-class questioning, that's looking over homework, independent practice, guided practice. We've gathered a lot of information. So anyways, like I said, we're going to be talking about differentiated lesson planning, and we're going to actually get into the Helix model a little bit later on in the class after we do some more boot camps on the specific disabilities, and we learn a lot more specific best practices for each of the said disability categories that we're going to be hitting on in this class. But just as an introduction, you can always keep this past variable in mind. The idea of prioritizing what you're going to teach. Prioritize, plan your instruction, pre-plan. The more preparation that you can do, the better outcome you're going to get. Also with that, understand the idea of backward design when we're talking about objectives. We're planning our assessments based on the amount of resources that we're expending during the lesson, during the unit, during whatever it is, because if we're not assessing what we're teaching, then we're having big test validity issues. And we're not truly testing what we've been doing direct instruction on if we have 50% of our points are covering one standard when only 20% of the instructional time was spent to cover said standard. And then the idea of adaptation, the idea that we need to meet multiple learning styles, we need to be able to meet multiple learning levels, both lower and higher, and we need to create both rote maintenance rehearsal level opportunities for students who need more reinforcement, while also providing other sorts of more independent or self-directed problem-based critical thinking or other sorts of creative opportunities for students to be able to use said facts that they've already learned and they've already mastered in new creative ways that's going to help them engage and not tune out instead of just giving them another worksheet. And then systematically teaching, whether we have times for direct instruction where we need to bring people together, make sure we're using proper formative assessment, making sure that we're using the SCREAM model, and then systematically evaluating, using proper pre-testing, using proper formative assessment, evaluating guided practice, stopping, checking at particular points, critical points for understanding, going over independent practice, using independent and guided practice to be able to allocate resources for a review, How do we need to allocate those resources? Then using our summative data and being able to use all of that to be able to predict, and then to be able to then reflect on how our summative data looks at, and we should have some sort of pretty positive correlation between how we think they're going to do and how they actually do. And if we don't, if we have a kind of a disconnect there, then we need to go back to the drawing board and we need to look and see where the disconnect happened, because that's going to be the key to help, instead of just repeating the same lesson next time. That's going to be the key to help us improve and get better outcomes. So anyways, this is just meant as a relative introduction to this idea of differentiation of instruction, universal design learning theory. We will spend a good 2 hours later on in the semester doing differentiated lesson planning, using specific standards, specific ideas, and specific strategies after we've learned and done all of our disability boot camps. But for right now, that's going to be all, so thank you guys. As far as the Chapter 6 notes, I have a few questions on the Blackboard, and what you can do is I have a discussion board opened up. It should be called Chapter 6 Discussion Board, and you can just answer those questions in there. Make a post. No reply is necessary. Just answer the questions. So thank you, and I'll see you guys in Chapter 7.